So we're going to be in the textbook now. We begin on page 221, and just like we saw when we looked at dominant seventh chords, the way that composers used dominant seventh chords and resolved them and approached them was sometimes different in instrumental music than it was in vocal music. So when we do our four-part voice leading exercises, our part writing exercises, those are much more strictly controlled, and we have to follow all the rules when we do those ones. When composers are writing string quartets or symphonies or piano sonatas, they were less inclined to follow the rules quite so strictly in order to get certain effects that they were looking for, or to just not worry so much about some of these things. So, for example, in 14-7, ready, go listen to it. Okay? So, you heard, like some of these other ones, this goes by pretty quickly. But if you listen carefully, you'll hear that we actually have parallel perfect fifths between the viola and the first violins. There, the pickup into measure 7. There's an A and an E, leading to a G and a D. So that's an illustration of the issue that I had talked about last time about how you have to be careful with the leading tone half diminished seventh chord in major because of the potential for those parallel fifths. In this case, Haydn simply says, whatever, I'm going to do the parallel fifths. Not so concerned about it because it's an instrumental texture and it's a fast tempo, so we don't notice those parallel fifths unless we're cued into the fact that they exist and that we can listen for them. On the next page of your textbook, in 222, we have a really interesting piece from Brahms. This is a piece for double SATB choir. So go check that out. Here, at the end of this piece, you could argue that this isn't really a leading tone seventh chord. It's got all the pitches there. I would tend to hear this as a plagal cadence from 4 on the downbeat of the penultimate measure to 1 on the last measure, and there's just some passing tones in between there that happen to form the notes of a leading tone seventh chord. But you could argue it either way. You might say, look, the tonal template suggests that if there's a predominant, like this 4 chord in the penultimate measure, that there should be a dominant between it and the tonic. And that's what we get, or Brahms knows this, and so he gives it to us in the form of this pretty uncommon leading tone seventh chord in second inversion. The pitches are there. I'm not sure that I buy that it's harmonic, but you can decide for yourself. So there's a couple examples in major. Like I said, it doesn't come up all that often in the major mode, the leading tone seventh chord, because it's that half diminished quality, which tends to be less potent moving toward the dominant. In contrast, the fully diminished seventh chord in minor we see all over the place because it's very, very potent. It sounds like this. It's got a very strong pull to tonic because of all those tendency tones that we talked about, right? There are 4 tendency tones, and they all tend to resolve to pitches of the tonic. So composers use this all the time. We see an example from Bach on page 224. So go listen to some organ music. Okay, so hopefully you were following along with the book as you listened. You can look at the organ score, or lots of times I just look at the textural reduction because it's simpler. You don't have 3 staves to deal with. And you can see there how Bach uses a fully diminished seventh chord. He's in the minor mode. This is very dark music. And like I was saying before, sometimes composers they didn't care as much about that last tendency tone, about making sure to resolve it properly. Here he doesn't resolve it properly, but he does kind of hide the fact that he has parallel fifths by parallel, what is it called? unequal fifths by including some suspensions and other stuff going on the surface of the music. But it really is parallel fifths from a diminished fifth to a perfect fifth there in the inner voices. And then again in the next measure, as you'll notice. The last example from Bach, Als Jesus Christus in der Nacht. This is an interesting one. So go listen to it first, and then we'll talk about it for a moment. Okay, so the progression here only makes sense a couple different ways. The first possibility is what's listed there on that first line, where we have 6 in A minor, moving to a 2 half diminished, to a 7 on the second eighth note of that measure. So the dominant chord between the predominant and the tonic, that dominant chord, which in this case is a leading tone 7th chord, is only in existence for 1/8 note of time. But it's there, the notes are there. And because that's what we expect from our tonal template, we can argue that that is a dominant chord. And then the same thing 2 beats later. Same deal. The other analysis might be better, might not, I don't know. You could talk about it, speculate, is that the A on the downbeat of measure 3 is actually a non-chord tone. That's a suspension that resolves downward to the G sharp. This is in the alto voice. And if that A is a suspension, then there's no 2 chord. It's just a 7 chord with a suspension before it. So, you can play that at the keyboard, listen to it again, see if you buy one way or the other, if you hear 2 separate chords on beat 1, or if you simply hear a suspension into the actual harmony, which comes on the and of 1 and the and of 3. I would tend to hear it as a suspension, but that's just me. Maybe you'll hear it differently. Okay, so that's kind of what's going on with 2/7 and 6/7. Now, your job is to head back to the blog post for a little assignment.